Many people who have near-death experiences describe the same impossible moment. I left my body. They say they floated above the operating table. They saw the doctors. They heard conversations. They came back with memories they should not have had. 1991, Phoenix, Arizona. A patient named Pam Reynolds enters the Bardo Neurological Institute for a procedure her surgeons call Operation Standstill. Her body is cooled to a temperature that would normally be fatal. For part of the procedure, blood flow to the brain is halted, and the EEG shows no measurable activity. She is brought as close to death as modern surgery can take a living patient. When she returns, she describes the bone saw, the surgeon's words, details the team later confirmed. Researchers have debated this case for 30 years, all of them circling the same question: did consciousness leave the body? Buddhism finds that question interesting, but it has a more disturbing one. Who left? If there was never a permanent self inside the body to begin with? That is the question this video is about. I have been studying Buddhist accounts of the death moment for years. The doctrine is precise where precision is possible, and remains honest about its limits where it isn't. The question that kept pulling me back was simpler than any of the doctrinal debates. Does the Buddhist account of the death moment describe something real? Or is it the most elaborate form of wishful thinking in human history? Then I started reading the NDE research carefully. The careful academic answer became harder to hold. What I kept finding, across the clinical research and the Buddhist texts, was an overlap that neither side had properly examined. Few traditions have produced an account of the death moment as systematic, practice-based, and psychologically detailed as Buddhism. What it offers is an examination of what consciousness may do as the body shuts down, built through centuries of meditation and direct investigation. That question pulls us into territory the NDE literature has never properly mapped. Not just who leaves the body, but what the mind carries with it, what it meets on the other side of distraction, and why some people return from darkness while others return from light. This is not another afterlife map. An earlier episode here covers what Buddhist doctrine says happens across the full arc after death. This video asks a narrower question, and a harder one. What remains when sight, sound, memory, and identity start to fail? 4 questions run through this video, and only the last one is the question Buddhism actually built itself to answer. A near-death experience, NDE, is a cluster of perceptions reported by people who have come close to clinical death. Separation from the body, movement toward light, a review of one's life, a boundary that cannot be crossed. Raymond Moody coined the term in 1975. The phenomenon itself is far older. Before the research, one observation about how NDE accounts have been handled. The NDE has been claimed by almost every tradition with something to prove. Christians cite the light as confirmation of heaven. New Age movements point to the warmth and presence as proof of universal spirit. Skeptics point to the void, the darkness, and the experience of non-existence as signs of a brain under extreme stress. Researchers argue about whether the phenomenon confirms or undermines materialism. Each side selects the accounts that fit and sets aside the ones that don't. Buddhism enters this conversation from a different angle. It does not need NDEs as proof. The account of the dying mind was developed independently, through practice, through direct investigation, long before anyone studied NDEs clinically. If the evidence aligns with that account, the alignment deserves serious examination. If it doesn't, The doctrine does not depend on it. That posture, open to correspondence, not dependent on it, is what makes the comparison worth making at all. The evidence itself deserves careful attention. Moody didn't set out to challenge medicine. He was a philosophy student collecting accounts from patients who had come close to death. Curious, systematic, with no particular agenda. By 1975, he had 150 accounts. He expected to be dismissed. What he didn't expect was the response from the medical community: cardiologists, combat surgeons, intensive care nurses. One after another, quietly, they began sharing records they had kept for years, told to no one, waiting for someone else to go first. In 2001, Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel published what remains one of the most methodologically rigorous NDE studies conducted. 344 cardiac arrest survivors, prospective design, published in The Lancet. 18% reported NDEs. The accounts held consistent structure across age, religion, nationality, and prior belief. What did the survivors report? Separation from the body, awareness continuing without sensory input, a threshold that could not be crossed, a presence or light, described across vastly different cultural backgrounds, as more real than anything encountered in waking life. A review of one's life, something more intimate and more disturbing than memory, and a return, accompanied by specific reluctance. The structure repeats, the imagery changes. A Christian may describe Jesus or a luminous heaven. A Buddhist may describe bodhisattvas or boundless light. A secular person may describe presence or intelligence without a name. The clothing is cultural. The structure underneath remains recognizable across backgrounds. Then there are the cases that deepen the question without resolving it. Researcher Kenneth Ring, along with Sharon Cooper, documented accounts from blind experiencers, including people blind from birth, who described what they interpreted as visual perception during cardiac arrest. Their methodology was qualitative and case-based. The findings remain contested. The question they raise is harder than the findings themselves. What does it mean to perceive when every ordinary instrument of perception has stopped? More recently, the AWARE-2 study, published in 2023 under cardiologist Sam Parnia, examined consciousness during CPR across multiple centers. Of 28 interviewed survivors, 11 reported memories or perceptions suggestive of awareness during cardiac arrest. One identified an auditory stimulus. Nobody identified the visual target. EEG data showed activity patterns later into CPR than previously assumed. AWARE-2 did not prove consciousness survives death. It showed something narrower and stranger. Awareness-like reports arise around cardiac arrest, and the brain's activity during that window may be more complex than the flatline narrative suggests. The skeptics deserve their moment, and a genuine one. Oxygen deprivation, anesthesia, temporal lobe stimulation, and memory reconstruction under stress are all plausible partial explanations for NDE features. Buddhism does not need to deny any of that. Dependent origination, the doctrine that all experiences arise through conditions, expects the dying brain to contribute conditions to whatever is experienced at death. The question is whether those conditions fully contain the experience, or whether something in the accounts exceeds what the conditions alone can explain. That question is still open. A nurse who had spent 2 decades in cardiac and intensive care described her first natural death in a hospice setting, far from the equipment she had always depended on, in language that stayed with her for years afterward. "Something leaves," she said. She was alive, and then she was gone. I kept thinking, what is it that leaves? She had no framework for the question at the time. Buddhism, she said later, was the first tradition she encountered that took it seriously. one that neither collapsed it into faith nor dismissed it as neurological noise. That question, what leaves and who, is exactly what 50 years of NDE survivors have been asking. Buddhism answers it differently than any of them expected. Many NDE survivors describe it the same way. I left my body. That question from the opening, who left, turns out to be the most consequential philosophical correction in the entire Buddhist account of death. Getting it wrong turns everything that follows into something Buddhism explicitly rejected, and rejected more than once. In the Mahatanha Saṅkhāra Sutta, MN 38, a monk named Sati claims the Buddha teaches that the same consciousness passes unchanged from one life to the next. The correction is immediate. In Bhikkhu Sujato's translation, "Foolish man, to whom have you ever known me to teach the Dhamma in that way? Haven't I said in many ways that consciousness is dependently arisen? Without a condition, there is no arising of consciousness." What continues at death is not a self. It is a vijnana stream, a flow of consciousness conditioned by what preceded it, carrying karmic momentum without carrying a permanent passenger. A flame passes from one lamp to another. The flame that arrives is not identical to the flame that left. Neither is it unrelated. The continuity is real. The identity is not. The Anatta doctrine, no self, is a description of what the mind reveals under direct investigation, not a metaphor, a finding. The detailed Theravāda account of the dying process draws primarily from Buddhaghosa's 5th century Visuddhimagga, chapter 17. The Abhidhammattha Saṅkhāra elaborates the account further. These are commentarial sources, building systematically on the canonical Abhidhamma Pitaka. As the body fails, the 5 sense consciousnesses withdraw sequentially: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. Each sensory channel closes. What remains, when all 5 have gone dark, is the mano vijnana, mental consciousness still active and processing, without any sensory input whatsoever. Read that against NDE testimony. Survivors describe a state of awareness that persists after the body has ceased to function, something they call more direct, more unmediated than ordinary waking experience. The Theravāda tradition describes an architecture of the dying mind that runs strikingly close to this. Over 1,000 years before the first cardiologist sat down with a patient who had come back from clinical death. Declaring it proof would outrun the evidence, but the parallel deserves serious attention. As the sense consciousnesses withdraw, the Visuddhimagga describes something else arising: the Kamma Nimitta, signs of karma, or the Gati Nimitta, signs of destination. These are the impressions that surface as the dying mind's habitual filtering dissolves. The deepest patterns of a lifetime, the most frequently repeated actions, the most emotionally charged moments, rise to consciousness without the editing and suppression the living mind applies automatically, not chosen, something that surfaces as if from beneath everything the person thought they knew about themselves. Many NDE survivors describe something resembling this, images of profound personal significance arising unbidden, without effort, without selection. That correspondence is one of the more unsettling things the NDE literature stumbled into. The Anguttara Nikaya then names something with extraordinary restraint: the Pabhasara Citta, the luminous mind. In the Pabhasara Sutta, Book of Ones, Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha states, "Luminous monks is this mind, and it is defiled by incoming defilements." Across NDE accounts, survivors describe a light, a clarity, presence, and recognition that they consistently call more real than anything encountered in waking life. Buddhism makes no claim that this light is God or proof of survival. It asks a subtler question: What happens when awareness appears without its usual coverings? That question matters. The correspondence between what NDE survivors describe and what the Pabbasaracita points toward is not a conclusion. It is an opening worth holding carefully. One further point the NDE literature almost entirely overlooks. The jhanas, the meditative absorptions described throughout the Pali Canon, matter here for a specific reason. They show that Buddhist practice approached consciousness not through belief alone, but through states that living practitioners could enter, examine, and return from. In Nirodha Samapatti, the cessation of perception and feeling cease altogether. This is the most refined attainment in Theravāda practice. Practitioners know this state through entering it, emerging from it, and examining the before and after. Practitioners cannot narrate the experience from within cessation. That would contradict its nature. But through repeated approach and emergence, Buddhist practitioners learned that ordinary waking consciousness is not the only mode of mind available to investigation. This is why the Buddhist account of the death moment is not metaphysical speculation. The map was drawn, at least partially, by people who had walked part of the territory while still alive. The I that left the body was never quite what the survivor thought it was. A stream of conditioned consciousness, encountering perhaps a glimpse of what awareness is without the weight of a lifetime pressing down on it. Buddhism does not ask, where did the soul go? It asks something more disturbing. What did the mind carry with it? One of the most frequently cited accounts in NDE research belongs to a mechanic named Tom Sawyer, documented in detail by Kenneth Ring in Heading Toward Omega, whose life review shifted the direction of the researchers listening to him. In 1978, a truck fell on Sawyer in his garage. He was clinically dead for 15 minutes. What he described afterward was not a memory of his life. It was a reckoning with it. During his life review, Sawyer relived a fight he had been in years earlier, except this time, he experienced it from the other man's side. He felt all 32 blows he had inflicted, landing on himself. The cracking teeth, the blood, the fear of the man on the receiving end. Every sensation, every consequence, felt, not watched, not as memory, as direct experience. This detail separates the NDE life review from anything psychology had a prior framework for. Memory is first person. What this and many other life review accounts describe is structurally different. A confrontation with the full consequence of one's own actions, from the outside, with no editing available, no self-justification, no access to the narrative the living mind had spent years constructing. Buddhism has a name for what rises at that moment: Saṅkhāra. The Dhammapada opens, Mano Pubangama Dhamma, Mano Seta Mano Maya. Mind precedes all phenomena. Mind is their master. Mind is their maker. The actions of a lifetime do not disappear. They leave impressions, Saṅkhāra, in the Sita Santana, the mind stream. These impressions shape perception, shape habit, shape the character of consciousness itself. When the habitual filtering dissolves at the death moment, they surface. Not as punishment, not as judgment from outside, as weight. The kama nimitta come from the mind's own patterns, the most frequently repeated actions, the most emotionally charged moments, the deepest channels carved by a lifetime of volitional choice. Life review accounts share a character researchers find consistently difficult to categorize. Survivors don't experience their actions as events they remember. They experience them as events they relive, from every side simultaneously. The cruelty and the kindness both. The deliberate harm and the unthinking generosity, felt, not observed. Karma in Buddhist doctrine is not a ledger kept by heaven. It is a description of how volitional action shapes the mind that performs it, and how, when the body stops, that shaped mind finally meets itself, without the daily noise of distraction. The living mind works hard to maintain a coherent self-narrative. It justifies, it minimizes, it remembers intentions rather than consequences. When that machinery stops, what remains is what was actually done, not what was meant, not what was rationalized afterward, but what actually landed in the lives of others as consequence. In the Maranasati Suttas of the Anguttara Nikaya, AN 6.19 and 6.20, the Buddha praises recollection of death not as morbidity, but as urgency. The practitioner who holds each day against the thought of dying before nightfall is described as heedful, alert, awake to what the undistracted mind reveals. The early Theravāda tradition also practiced the charnel ground contemplations, monastics directed to observe a decomposing body and understand without turning away. This body, too, is of the same nature. It has not gone beyond this fate. Buddhism called this preparation. The NDE calls it something the survivor did not expect and cannot unexperience. The life review reveals, from both directions, clarity that arises from within. No external authority delivers it. The mind, for the first time, seeing what it actually became. Researcher Nancy Evans Bush spent decades documenting what the popular NDE literature almost never discusses. Not the light, not the peace, not the reluctant return. The accounts survivors rarely share because they are too disturbing, too far from the narrative that has made NDEs culturally acceptable. Bruce Grayson and other researchers estimate distressing NDEs at roughly 11 to 22% of all accounts. The real figure may be higher, because survivors of terrifying NDEs report them far less frequently and forget them faster. 3 categories emerge consistently. The void, total consciousness with total emptiness. No light, no presence, no contact, only awareness, with nothing to be aware of and no ability to end the awareness. The threatening landscape, environments of suffering whose imagery draws from the experiencer's own cultural vocabulary of fear. The nature beneath the imagery, inescapable and closed, runs through accounts regardless of background. And the most philosophically disturbing category of all, the experience of non-existence while still aware. Knowing that one exists, being unable to locate anything that constitutes a self. Awareness without a subject. To Buddhism, these are not embarrassing exceptions. They are the point. If death removes distraction, the mind does not merely meet light. It meets whatever it has practiced becoming. This is Maranasana Karma, near-death karma. The nature of the living mind shapes the dying mind, not as cosmic punishment, but as direct consequence. A mind habituated to fear, craving, and aversion carries those tendencies into the death moment. It meets them there, magnified, with nothing left to interrupt the confrontation. The Bardo journey has its own episode here. What matters in this context is one specific insight from it. The Bardo Thodol, known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is traditionally attributed to Padmasambhava, revealed as a terma by Karma Lingpa in the 14th century. It describes the peaceful and wrathful deities as appearances of mind, wisdom displays, symbolic forms arising from the tendencies the practitioner has cultivated or failed to recognize. In many Tibetan interpretations, they carry a depth of primordial awareness that a prepared mind recognizes, and an unprepared mind cannot. What a mind saturated in clarity meets is luminosity. its own deepest nature. What a mind saturated in fear meets is its own fear, with no body to escape into. Buddhist death practice did not begin in Tibet. It begins in early Buddhism, with Maranasati, with the charnel ground contemplations, with the Buddha's repeated insistence that the state of the mind matters most when everything else falls away. The Tibetan tradition elaborated this with extraordinary symbolic and practical precision, but the root runs the same across schools. A hospice nurse described a dying patient with advanced cancer whose attention remained entirely on the person she loved, not on her own dying. Each day she prepared meals for her husband, ensuring he would be fed after she was gone. The account proves nothing medically, but it illustrates the Buddhist point with painful clarity. The mind does not arrive at death empty. It carries only what it has practiced most deeply. A mind oriented entirely toward another's well-being, toward karuna, has, at the critical moment, loosened the self-grasping that generates most of the terror of dissolution. And then there is the most extraordinary evidence that Buddhist death practice is not merely theoretical. Tukdam. Tibetan masters who enter a meditative state at the moment of death and remain in it, by all external evidence, for days afterward. The body does not decompose at the normal rate. The chest area retains warmth. The face holds an expression unlike anything produced by ordinary death. Morticians and medical professionals have said so independently. Researchers at the University of Wisconsin Center for Healthy Minds documented slowed post-mortem decomposition across multiple Tukdam cases. Earlier EEG-focused research found no detectable brain activity after clinical death in these individuals. Tukdam does not prove Buddhist metaphysics, but it shows something almost as interesting. Buddhist death practice is serious enough that science has begun studying its physical traces. The difference between a luminous NDE and a terrifying one, Buddhism argues, is not fate, not divine preference. It is the character of a lifetime's mental cultivation, meeting itself when nothing else remains to look at. Buddhism does not claim NDEs prove rebirth. That precision matters. The Buddha classified certain questions as avyakata, the undetermined, whether consciousness persists after the body's dissolution, whether what NDE survivors encountered constitutes evidence of survival. Both questions fall into that category. The Buddha was not being evasive when he refused to answer them. Claims that outrun direct investigation are not wisdom. They are speculation wearing wisdom's clothes. What Buddhist doctrine holds across Theravāda, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, despite their significant disagreements, is a single position, consistent across schools and centuries. The mind brought to death is the mind cultivated in life. No exception. No last-minute reversal. No ritual compliance that substitutes for the actual character of mental habits built across a lifetime. The most carefully preserved death scene in Buddhist literature is the Buddha's own, in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, DN 16. He dies consciously, surrounded by the Sangha and lay followers, moving through the jhanas sequentially, ascending through the formless attainments, entering and releasing the cessation of perception and feeling. His last recorded words, in Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, Vayadhamma Saṅkhāra, Apamadana Sampadetha, all conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your liberation with diligence. Not a prayer, not a last rite, an instruction delivered from the threshold. Every tradition of Buddhist death practice has oriented itself toward that model ever since. The prepared death, the death without surprise, the mind that meets its final moment with recognition rather than terror. The Theravāda monk who cultivates Maranasati daily, anchoring each day in the recognition that this life will end, and the mind meeting that ending is the mind being built right now. The Tibetan practitioner who rehearses the death moment in retreat for decades before it arrives. The Zen practitioner for whom every moment of clear, undistracted attention is, in one specific sense, a preparation for the moment when attention is all that remains. None of them are purchasing a better rebirth through spiritual achievement. They are trying to understand the mind so completely, so directly, that even its final moment, stripped of every familiar landmark, holds no surprises. 50 years of NDE research and 2.5 millennia of Buddhist inquiry have arrived, from opposite directions, at the same threshold. The withdrawal of the senses, the surfacing of what the mind has become, a depth of awareness the dying process cannot extinguish, the state of consciousness at death reflecting the life that preceded it. The body matters, the brain matters. Buddhism does not deny that, but it refuses to treat the brain as the whole story. Consciousness arises through conditions, bodily, mental, karmic, relational, not through one isolated cause. This is pradityasamutpada, at the boundary between being and whatever follows it. Whether consciousness persists beyond the body's cessation is an open question, one the NDE data has never managed to close, and a question the Buddha consistently declined to answer from the outside. But whether the state of consciousness at death reflects the character of a lifetime's mental cultivation, that question Buddhism answered long ago, and has not retreated from since. Many NDE survivors report one striking consequence upon return: a dramatic reduction in the fear of death. Not because the experience was comfortable, not because they received assurance about what waits beyond, but because they met, briefly, accidentally, without any preparation, a depth of awareness in themselves that the dying process could not extinguish. Buddhism does not reduce that meeting to a single label. In Theravāda, it speaks of the pabhasaracita, the luminous mind, defiled by incoming defilements, but luminous in its nature. In Mahayana, of Tathagata Garbha, Buddha nature, the seed of awakening present in every sentient being. In Tibetan tradition, of Rigpa, the clear light of awareness that the death moment reveals to those prepared to recognize it. Different vocabularies, not identical doctrines, but the same discipline beneath them all. Learn to recognize the mind before death forces that recognition upon you. The question Buddhism leaves open is the one it has always left open. What kind of mind are you building right now, and would you be willing to meet it alone when there is nothing left to hide behind? If something in this video opened a question rather than closing one, that discomfort is the point. Buddhist inquiry has never been about comfortable answers. It has been about the right questions, held with enough precision that they actually lead somewhere. If you have had an experience near death, or know someone who has, leave it in the comments. Buddhism has been asking questions like this for 25 centuries. You might be surprised how close the map comes. The Buddhist Schools series on this channel has been building toward questions exactly like this one. The Vajrayana overview and the episode on Arhat versus Bodhisattva both sit directly alongside what we examine today. Subscribe to keep going deeper, and if this raised a question you want explored, your question might already be the next video. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay wise.